Good evening. Tonight we will step into a story wrapped in velvet, but bleeding from within. Imagine the magnificent palace of Fontainebleau. Ceilings carved with angels. Corridors echoing with the footsteps of kings. It should have been the cradle of glory. Yet, on the 27th of June, 1550, beneath that gilded ceiling, a child was born under the whisper of astrologers. This child is born beneath a sinister moon. His name was Charles. Not Charles the Conqueror. Not Charles the Saint, but Charles IX, who would later be remembered by a far more chilling name, the Cannibal Prince of France. The kingdom this boy inherited was already rotten from within. Catholics and Protestants sharpening daggers beneath the altar, nobles clawing for power, and peasants struggling not to starve. And upon a throne heavy as a sword's edge, a frail child was thrust to be king. So what happens when a fragile soul is forced to wear a crown soaked in terror tonight? We will find the answer together. For Charles IX was not merely a king. He was the embodiment of nightmares, nurtured by Catherine de Medici, the dark queen of Renaissance Europe, then unleashed to spill blood upon a land already drowning in it. They whispered, he spoke with demons, that he drank the blood of the dead, that he hunted men as though they were beasts. Whether truth or legend, the screams from his reign still echo to this day. So, dim the lights, sit back in comfort, and let us open a bloody chapter where nightmares once wore the crown. Chapter 1. Childhood and the shadow of Catherine de Medici. Charles was not born to become king. He was the fifth son of King Henry II and Queen Catherine de Medici, the woman known as the Dark Power of France. In a court full of intrigues, a child standing too far from the throne was often nothing more than a faint shadow. But fate, as cruel as it always is, took away Charles's brothers one by one. And then, at only 10 years old, the frail boy with trembling hands was placed upon the throne of France. The throne, which sounds glorious, was in truth like a sword hanging above his head. France in the 16th century was fractured like shattered glass. Catholics and Protestants. Two beliefs turned into two blades. The old noble families fought endlessly, while common folk prayed only not to starve in the barren fields. In that world, Charles was merely a fragile boy, his eyes always distant, as though haunted by invisible ghosts. People said that from an early age he was unlike other children. He found no joy in books or music, but was consumed by hunting. Yet this was not just the pastime of a prince, but an obsession. Charles could kill dozens of animals in a single day, returning to the palace with blood-stained clothes and a strange smile, not the smile of a victor, but of someone trying to escape himself. And behind him, there was always the figure of one woman, Catherine de Medici. She was a widow from distant Italy, once scorned in the French court, neglected by her husband, mocked by courtiers. But when Henry II died in a jousting accident, Catherine suddenly became the most powerful figure in France. She believed in omens, in astrology, in horoscopes and the strange potions of Italian physicians, but above all, she believed in one thing: the survival of the Valois dynasty, at any cost. To Catherine, Charles was not merely a son, he was a pawn, a tool to hold on to the throne, the last wall preventing the collapse of the dynasty. Rumors said she whispered prophecies into his ear, warned him of unseen enemies, even gave him strange medicines to calm his spirit, substances that today might have been opium, mercury, sweet poisons that slowly consumed him. Charles grew up in a world where no faith was pure. Each brother's death was an omen, a curse. And when the crown was placed upon his head in 1560, after the suspicious death of his brother Francis II, France did not see a true king, only a frail boy trembling like a puppet in his mother's hands. The French court at that time was a stage filled with daggers, the Guise family, fervent Catholics, whispered for the blood of Protestants. On the other side, the Huguenots swore vengeance for decades of persecution. And in the middle stood Catherine, the widowed queen, like a shadow controlling the strings of the stage, and Charles. The boy only wanted silence, but in a court soaked in blood, silence could be more dangerous than a scream. Chapter 2: A Fractured Kingdom and the Bloody War of Religion. France in the 16th century was not a united kingdom, but resembled a shattered chessboard. On that board, each piece carried a belief, a scheme, and a blade. The Catholics, who were the majority, believed that any tolerance toward the Protestants was a betrayal of the faith. On the other hand, the Protestants, also known as the Huguenots, longed for religious freedom, and they were ready to take up arms to claim it. For the peasants, they cared nothing for the doctrines of Christ or Luther. They only wanted their land not to be seized, their harvests not to be burned, and their families not dragged into the spiral of hatred. But such a wish was too costly in an age when blood flowed more easily than forgiveness. When Charles IX sat upon the throne at the age of 10, he was not the one directing this game. The true power lay in the hands of Catherine de Medici. She skillfully pivoted between factions, promising, threatening, and spreading rumors. For Catherine, the game was not about victory or defeat, but about buying time for the Valois dynasty to endure. Yet the French court resembled a tragedy in which every character wanted to stab another in the back. The Guise family, powerful Catholic lords, sought to annihilate the Huguenots to affirm their position. The Protestants, meanwhile, had leaders like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, who was not only a warrior, but also a symbol of resilience against oppression. And Charles, the young king, was trapped between ambitions and whispers. At only 13 or 14 years old, he was already suffering violent outbursts of rage, uncontrollable fits of weeping, and nightmares that kept him awake through the night. People called them the Black Dreams, visions where forests burned, rivers turned to blood, and faceless figures lurked around him. Some said it was a sign of God's punishment. Others whispered that Catherine herself was feeding her son sweet poisons to keep him under control. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear: France had no king. France had only a curse sitting on the throne. In attempts to salvage the situation, peace treaties were signed. In 1563, then in 1570, Catholics and Protestants repeatedly sat down at the table. But each agreement was nothing more than a blood-stained piece of paper, the ink not yet dry before it was ripped apart by swords. Hatred was too deep, suspicion too great, and too much blood had already been spilled to ever dry. Charles, though still young, seemed to sense his own helplessness. He could not force the Catholics to forgive, nor could he protect the Huguenots from the blades of the Guise. Every attempt to be the king of peace dissolved into nights when Paris burned red with violence. In his rare moments of clarity, Charles whispered that all he longed for was silence. But to be a king in times of chaos, silence was no different than lighting the fuse of an explosion. And indeed, that fuse was being prepared in secret by Catherine. A fateful wedding was drawing near. And it would not be only a marriage, but a blood sacrifice for one of the most horrifying religious tragedies Europe would ever witness. Chapter 3: The Fateful Wedding and the Night of St. Bartholomew's Horror. In the summer of 1572, Paris was adorned like a bride. Church bells rang, flags fluttered over narrow streets, and from all corners, nobles of both Catholic and Protestant faiths poured into the capital. People believed this was the moment when France would finally find peace. For the wedding had been set, Marguerite de Valois, sister of Charles IX, would marry Henri de Navarre, the young Protestant prince full of promise. This union was not only the joining of two individuals, but the binding of two faiths, two opposing worlds. It was expected to heal the bleeding wounds of decades of civil war. In the halls glowing with candlelight, glasses of wine were raised in toasts. Joyous music resounded, and the people cheered beneath the August sun. Yet behind the golden embroidered curtains, blades had already been sharpened. Catherine de Medici, the mother, the regent, the shadow behind the throne, was far from reassured by this prospect. In Henry of Navarre, she did not see a son-in-law, but a threat. If the Protestants gained too much influence, the Valois throne would tremble. If her daughter bound herself to a powerful husband from the other side, would Charles, her fragile, trembling son, still hold his crown? And so, in suffocating chambers, factions gathered to whisper. The Guise family, the fanatical Catholic lords, demanded blood. The Huguenots, gathered in Paris, trusted in the promise of safety under the crown. And Charles IX, the young king, stood among them all like a lost soul. He heard the clinking of blades in the dark, heard his mother's whispers, and even voices that no one else could hear. Then the fateful moment arrived. The night of the 23rd of August, 1572. Paris still resounded with wedding music. But somewhere, an order was whispered. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Huguenot leader, was dragged from his bed, stabbed through the chest, then thrown into the street. And when the first scream rang out, the gates of Paris instantly turned into the gates of hell. In the darkness, bands of Catholic soldiers poured into the streets. They carried spears, axes, swords, and a fanaticism that nothing could quench. Any house showing signs of being Protestant was broken into. Men were cut down on their own thresholds. Women were dragged into the streets, some stabbed, others thrown into wells. Children cried out and then fell silent. Screams echoed across Paris, mingling with the stench of blood and smoke, as if the entire city had been swallowed by a collective nightmare. From the balcony of the Louvre Palace, Charles IX was seen. Some swore he only stood and watched, his face pale as stone, but others claimed he shouted, his voice booming like thunder, "Kill them all. Let not one live to accuse me what the truth was." No one knows for certain. But that night, and the days that followed, Paris drowned in blood. It is estimated that 10,000 lives were consumed, and the rumors began to spread, whispers of a king who not only delighted in blood, but hungered for it, that Charles IX drank wine mixed with blood, that he demanded the heart of a child brought to him on a silver platter. Perhaps they were only fabrications. Yet, in a reign soaked with blood and screams, who would dare to tell truth from lies? From that night onward, France was no longer merely a fractured kingdom. It had become a living graveyard, where even the king himself turned into a monstrous legend. Chapter 4. The mental collapse of Charles IX. After the massacre, after the bloody days of August 1572, Paris returned to an appearance of calm. The streets were cleared of corpses, the wells filled in, the burned houses left only smouldering ruins. But that silence was like a thin cloth covering a festering wound. And in the palace, once bright with wedding music, there now remained only the cautious footsteps of courtiers and their anxious glances. At the centre of it all, Charles IX began to fall into a bottomless abyss. It was said that after the night of the massacre, the young king could no longer sleep. Each night he awoke in terror, drenched in sweat, screaming that his bed was soaked in blood. Servants rushed to change the sheets and the linens. But only hours later he would scream again, pointing to invisible red stains and crying, "They have returned. Their blood is seeping into my skin." At times, Charles laughed hysterically, his laughter echoing down the corridors, uncertain whether it was joy or madness. But immediately after, he would collapse in a corner, face pressed into the shadows, whispering the names of the dead Coligny. "Coligny, forgive me." His eyes, once bright as the face of a young prince, now hollow, ringed with dark bruises. He began to see figures in mirrors, hear children crying within the walls, and see flames erupting on the ceiling even when the room was cold. The ghosts, perhaps only the hallucinations of a haunted soul, had now become his companions. Catherine de Medici, the mother, who always stood in the shadows, did not loosen her grip. She summoned Italian physicians, bringing strange vials of mercury, opium, and herbal-infused wine. They said these were cures for melancholia, the royal malady of sorrow. But those potions only made Charles weaker. He trembled, his hands skeletal, his gestures erratic. One day, he ordered a servant whipped for entering the room too quietly, and the next day punished another for stepping too loudly. No one could predict how his mood would shift within a single breath. Then came the time when Charles began to refuse bathing. His clothes wrinkled, stained with blood from violent coughing fits. His pillows had to be changed constantly, for whenever he lay down, blood seeped from his throat, soaking the linen red. In letters to friends and a few trusted confidants, he wrote with trembling hand, "There is a blood-soaked hand pressing upon my crown, and it will not let go." Even more terrifying, Charles began collecting bones. Some whispered that he had them dug from graves. Others believed they came from the corpses of the massacre. He wrapped them in blankets, murmuring to them as if they were invisible companions, "They forgive me. They only whisper mercy." But then, in nights of fever, he was seen biting into those bones like a desperate man gnawing on his own sins. In the eyes of his courtiers, Charles IX was no longer a king. He was a curse draped in velvet, a young body with a soul already rotted. France was no longer ruled by reason, but by groans, blood-choked coughs, and the phantoms haunting the mind of a boy wearing a crown. Chapter 5. The horrifying death and dark legacy of Charles IX. The final years of Charles IX resembled a broken play, where the main actor was only the shadow of himself. From a prince once pampered in silks, he had become a frail body, coughing blood whenever he spoke, his hands trembling like dry winter branches. Servants had to change his pillows constantly, for each was soon stained red. The royal physicians found no cure. They said he suffered from royal melancholy. Some claimed tuberculosis had consumed his lungs, while others whispered that Catherine, his own mother, had poisoned him with her medicines, drop by drop, over many years. What the truth was, no one dared to say. All that was certain was that each day, the young king sank further into a half-conscious state. In his final agony, Charles strangely revealed a simple longing affection. The only one who calmed him was Marie Touchet, his secret Protestant mistress. To Marie, he wrote trembling, yet ardent letters, "You are my angel, the star in my darkness." They had a son together, Charles's only child. In those rare moments, people glimpsed, not a monster, but a young man crushed beneath the storm of power. Yet love could not save him. In 1574, his illness worsened. He could no longer eat, swallowing only spoonfuls of broth before vomiting blood. His breathing was heavy, his room thick with the stench of dampness and decaying flesh. Servants described that whenever they touched his body, Sweat and blood clung to their hands as if they had touched a living corpse. Most terrifying of all was his final habit, collecting bones. Some said they were dug from graves. Others believed they came from the victims of the massacre. He held them close, kissed them, whispered pleas for forgiveness. On feverish nights, he was even seen gnawing at the bones, as if desperate to consume his own sins. Whether true or not, the image etched itself into the memory of his contemporaries. On the 30th of May, 1574, Charles IX exhaled his last breath. He was only 23 years old. His final sound was not a command, nor a prayer, but a scream so harrowing that courtiers shuddered, believing it was not the cry of a man, but the shriek of a soul being devoured. The death of Charles brought not sorrow, but relief. In the palace of Vincennes, the air was not of mourning, but of release. The court, the nobles, even his mother, regarded it as deliverance. Catherine immediately summoned his brother Henry from Poland to take the throne. Not a moment was given to grief. But the corpse of Charles was another nightmare. When opened for embalming, thick black blood poured from his mouth, his skin yellow, lips cracked, eyes sunken like dark pits. They used perfumes, wine, and spices, yet the stench of death clung. The funeral was rushed, sparse, reduced to obligatory rites. Even when laid in the tomb at Saint-Denis, he was not received as a king, but buried like a curse hidden beneath cold stone. And yet, the whispers did not vanish. In Paris taverns, in shadowed alleys, people still murmured, Charles IX did not die. His spirit lingers, mouth stained with blood, hands clutching bones. Some believed that children born on the day of St. Bartholomew's massacre were haunted by his ghost. Others swore his body never decayed, for he had already rotted while alive. Whether truth or folklore, the image of the Cannibal Prince became inseparable from French history, and his death was not an ending, but a ghastly warning that a rotten dynasty devours its own children. Charles IX, the young king who died at only 23, left behind no great victories, nor magnificent monuments. What he left history was screams, nightmares, and an indelible stain, the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. He is remembered as the Cannibal Prince, a gruesome name, yet one that reflects the desperation of a people searching for meaning in a reign of blood and madness. Yet, if we look more closely, Charles was not only a monster, he was also a victim of a decaying dynasty, of an ambitious mother, of inescapable religious conspiracies. A fragile boy turned into a tool of power, forced to wear a crown like a chain, forced to bear the sins of a disintegrating kingdom. The question lingers through the centuries: did he truly drink blood, gnaw human bones, or were these fabrications? Perhaps we will never know. But the more terrifying truth lies elsewhere under his reign. Rivers of blood were spilled, and for that reason, his ghost has never faded. Today, when one walks through the cold corridors of the Louvre, or when the wind sweeps across the dome of Saint-Denis, whispers say that if you listen long enough, you can still hear Charles calling, not the voice of a king, but of a young soul crushed by the machine of power, whispering in despair, "Forgive me." And perhaps the true legacy of Charles IX is a warning to us all that absolute power not only corrupts, but can turn even a child into the symbol of madness and bloodshed. Remember this, for history has never been only the past. It is a mirror, and sometimes, in the mirror, we may see ourselves